And so I would also add that I'm going to read my remarks for purposes both of clarity, in terms of understanding what I'm saying, and time efficiency, and to avoid going off on tangents, which those tangential points are not unimportant. And I'm glad to hear other comrades have already kind of filled up those holes in what I'm going to be saying. So on this, the 200th day of the special military operation by Russia and its allied forces in the Donbass, the Russian forces are bogged down in a grinding war of attrition. And it's a war that it is not allowed to win. And I would say that one side, the imperialist side, is fighting a war. And it's putting everything into it. If you just take the United States, since February 24th, 55 billion, give or take 10 billion, has already been put in terms of all forms of aid into Ukraine. Russia is fighting a limited war. That's what the SMO is. It's limited. And it's basically kind of sitting on the territory that it's taken. And I'm not going to get into the major setback on the Izium front, south of Kharkov, at the end of last week. It's the first significant victory for the Ukrainian forces. And I would just add quickly that this has sparked a war conclave in Moscow to rethink its objectives and the very nature of the conflict. Who can say what they're going to do? Certainly, I would hope they are going to reinforce that front, and they will, and then to back up with more support, the Donbass militias, who are, as courageous as they are, and as long as they've been fighting, they're not a professional army, okay? And they're facing the best that Ukraine has in this counteroffensive that took the Russian forces by surprise. Okay. Actually, I wasn't going to say much about it, but it doesn't change anything. But on the other hand, it does highlight what it means to have a limited special military operation. I would remind people that Russia has not declared war on Ukraine. Not is fighting NATO. It has been unclear in terms of what its objectives really are. So anyway, as I said, it's a war that Russia and its allies are not allowed to win. Okay? The US is going all in on this, not to win it. It's just they won't tolerate a Russian victory, even if it means fighting to the last Ukrainian. In fact, the US isn't concerned with actual military victory in Ukraine. It will throw any number of Ukrainian cannon fodder into the fire, perhaps the entire country if necessary, counting on inflicting a staggeringly high death toll from a protracted war that bleeds Russia dry. The proxy insurgency will contribute to the destabilization of Russia. This is its intention, facilitating a long-planned regime change operation and the carving up of the country itself, as other speakers have pointed out. That's the objective of this. But it's also, the other objective is one front in what's going to be, and it's already begun to be with the Taiwan, Pelosi's visit to Taiwan provocation, a two-front war. But in order for imperialism, from their strategic point of view, to fight that two-front war, they've got to tie Russia down in Ukraine and on its borders. So this is, I think, even clearer now than it was when we met in March. So unlike the centrists, we can't get trapped into viewing this through the narrow national lens of Ukraine alone. The war must be seen in an international context. As Trotsky wrote in his 1928 critique of the draft program of the Communist International, the international program must proceed directly from an analysis of the conditions and tendencies of the world economy and of the world political system taken as a whole in all its contradictions and connections. That is, with the mutually antagonistic interdependence of its separate parts. In the present epoch, the national orientation of the proletariat must and can flow only from a world orientation and not vice versa. Today, world capitalism is mired in deep crisis, as others have pointed out. Okay? The US rate of profit has not really recovered from the financial crisis of 2008. Yes, it's true, the mass of profits is increasing, okay? But the rate of profit is too low to sustain growth in real production. 60% of the growing mass of profit flows directly into financial markets. That's according to Alan Freeman, and Michael Hudson, I know, would say it's even higher than that. Okay, so I'll just take 60% out of every dollar of profit generated in this increasing mass of profits flowing basically into the energy sector very heavily, is going right into the fictitious capital of financialization. Fictitious capital is parasitizing on production, choking off new investment to a greater extent than at any time in the past 50 years. And it now demands a greater share of the world's surplus value in order to stay afloat. That's the world socialist surplus value, okay? Not simply the surplus value within the US itself, okay? That's something else again. It's entirely inadequate to keep this afloat, even though it will extract as much surplus value and intensify the rate of surplus value extraction in the US. American capitalism is using its productivity advantage to offload the crisis of valorization, which people have referred to what that is. The crisis of valorization is basically a crisis of profitability, okay, onto its European allies. Most of all, it is intensifying the looting of the global South, from which it has been draining value increasingly since 2008. The Federal Reserve in the US is responding to the inflationary crisis and the wage offensive of the working class by deliberately engineering a recession in the model of the Volcker shock treatment of the 1980s to create increased unemployment, to drive down wages, and it has nothing to do with fighting inflation. It will be stagflation, as we experienced in the 70s, but on a much higher level, a combination of stagnation in production and inflation at the same time. If anyone had lived through that like I did, and that was at 10% unemployment, 10% inflation, which we'll see at least that, okay? That's hard to describe, okay? It's just, we haven't experienced it yet in the US, but I do.
At about 8 minutes, Robert.
Thank you, Davey. Okay, moving along. Europe is looking at a new winter of discontent. Inflation in the UK is predicted to rise as high as 18%, and Goldman Sachs, I just read, says 22% by the end of the year. Half of British households are at risk of falling into poverty as a result of surging gas prices this winter. The NHS expects thousands to die because they can no longer afford to heat their homes. In Argentina, inflation is heading towards 70%. That was a couple of days ago when I wrote this, but now I see from Bloomberg that no, inflation right now in Argentina is 100%. Okay. The interest rate has climbed to 52% as the state tries to avert investors dumping peso assets. South America's third largest country is at the breaking point. And we just saw on September 1st, an assassination attempt by a fascist gunman on the life of Vice President Cristina de Fernandez Kirchner. Okay? And that fascist gunman is representative of a rising fascist movement that's expressed in this party. I don't know its name, but it has a Trumpian, like a monstrous character in its lead. I think it got 18% of the last vote, the recent vote. Okay, so basically to sum it up, comrades, we're on the cusp of two things at the same time. A working class upsurge, very much along the lines in Europe of the yellow vests in 2019. And that's already being called for in France. And on the other hand, a growing tendency towards state authoritarianism and even fascism on the other. The threat of fascism represents a great danger both in the imperialist centers and in the global South. Trump, Bolsonaro, Le Pen, and now this clown in Argentina, dangerous clown, must be taken seriously. And I'm sure there are others. The fastest growing, most aggressive sector of finance capital in the United States The vulture firms of private equity capital are supporting Trumpism. Okay, so the energy sector, Trumpism, and it may not be Trump, it may be DeSantis, whoever follows him, and it definitely will be one of them in 2024 as they've set these elections up. They've already rigged them. Okay, so it's going to be Trump, or it's going to be DeSantis, or Trump lookalike. Okay. The upsurge, of course, represents a great opportunity, but as we know, we lack revolutionary leadership. This is why we must build on efforts such as this panel to clarify our own thinking and to make links. We must continue towards the creation of a Zimmerwall left for the 21st century. The objective reality before us is that of imperialist war and imperialism. In just 20 years, not only in Europe, but in the Asia Pacific, to get to China, in just 20 years, China has surpassed the US as the world's leading trading partner. I would urge anyone to go on Google and look at that map. In 2000, I mean, there was like maybe 1 or 2 countries that had China as its major trading partner. Today, it's just kind of the EU core and a handful of other countries that don't have China as its major trading partner. Includes Australia and just about everybody else except, the EU core. China represents an intolerable challenge. One other point that I was just informed of, that life expectancy in China has now, after a long ascent, and a particularly steep one since 2000, has now surpassed that of the US. China represents an intolerable challenge to imperialism as both an economic and ideological competitor, as it remains a deformed worker state despite its large capitalist sector. I've written a whole paper on that, which people can read, and I would defend that absolutely. Okay, I called it a weird beast before, which is something akin to what Ian Donovan was describing, but I think I have to call it what it is, as Alan Gibson says, that it remains a deformed worker state, because I don't know how they get through COVID with 14,000 deaths out of how many people, billion, whatever, and that's it, 14,000, where we had 1 million and they stopped counting. At 1 million, they stopped counting the dead in the US. So building an international anti-war movement is the order of the day. Our forces are small, but 4/5 of the world, in big terms, is with us. We must build links with broader forces. And I would just point out, even some of the centrists are, in facing the reality of the consequences of the war, in terms of the effect on their own working class, say in England, and around the world as a whole, are breaking somewhat from the initial Russophobia of February 24th in the face of these emerging facts, reality. And the other centrist people have mentioned, who are with NATO, actually debating, the Morenoite currents actually debating whether it's legitimate to call for more NATO arms to Ukraine. Long thread we went through just recently on Facebook this week, unbelievable. But that is the reality of most of the centrists, the so-called, to our shame, Trotskyist groups, which they are not. Okay, they are not part of our movement. They have jumped the line, just like crossing a picket line. Okay. Mass protests are already beginning. 70,000 came onto the streets in Prague this week to demand an end to the EU-NATO war and to the inflation. But we must play our part to raise the banner of anti-imperialism and socialism at these protests. The two groups that dominated the Prague protest of 70,000 were the Czech Communist Party and the far right, the fascistic parties. So there's a big, there is a big gap there and a big danger from the right, okay, which is being sparked very much a kind of resurgent nationalism by the war. Okay. All right, so I would end just saying, on to the creation of a Zimmerwall left, onto building a international anti-war movement. I think that is the route to a new communist international. It flows from the road from a new Zimmerwall left through that path to the eventual gathering of forces to launch what we so badly lack and need, and that is a new communist international. So down with fascism and victory to socialism. So thank you very much. We're very glad to be here today with all you comrades.